In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajal farajahum. Brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And welcome to this third and last, let's call it part or volume based on the curriculum that we're following. The curriculum is made up of 3 volumes or 3 parts, and we are just about to start in the third part, which is entirely dedicated to the hereafter or the afterlife or al-ma'ad or eschatology, depending on how people refer to this theme in Islamic beliefs. So in the series that, not the mini-series itself, but in the big curriculum, we are at lesson 41 of 60. And in our actual encounters, we're at session 49. And this specific session has to do with trying to understand the, as it is called in the book that we're following, importance of understanding the outcome. The outcome meaning the outcome of our existence in this life. And that is obviously in the direction of the afterlife or the hereafter. So before I jump into the actual lesson, allow me to do a little bit of a recap on what we have covered until now. So whether you've been with us from the beginning or you're joining specifically for this new series, inshallah, this very, very quick recap at least gives you a glimpse of what we have covered and you understand where we're at and how it fits into the bigger picture. If you have not been following from the beginning, maybe one more reason for you to go back and inshallah see the benefit from reviewing quickly or not the lectures that are available online related to this topic. So the recap based on this specific lesson or courses, the big course. We began from the beginning by trying to understand the human need for religion. And this is the link between fitra or human nature and religion, and what we find in religion, the need for the absolute and the sacred. And we went from there to also understanding the place of reason and faith, and what is reason actually capable of accessing and what it is not, so the types of knowledge that we have access to as human beings. And this got us into the discussion about worldviews and the manner in which we understand the world. And we're going to come back to that today. So the worldviews that we discussed basically fall in 2 big categories. A human being either has a theistic worldview or a materialist worldview. Either you have a worldview, you see everything that you encounter and experience and interpret in your existence with a God in the center, or you don't, which means that you live a materialist world, you live a materialist life or experience, you believe in matter and things that you can experience empirically. Usually, if we want to reduce those 2 worldviews, they come down to this. And from there, we went into the existence of God. Of course, for the worldview, we explained why it's extremely important, and we're going to come back to that today. And we basically, all of this is related to the 3 big existential questions that we have as human beings. Where do we come from? What are we doing here? And where are we going? So with that in mind, and the answers to those 3 questions are going to constitute your worldview. And from there, we went into the arguments or the proofs for the existence of God. And we then tried to understand what type of God it is. So we started looking at some of the attributes of that God, and we discussed some of them in a little bit more detail than others. So the knowledge of God, the power, the life of God, wisdom, lordship, divinity, rububiyyah, uluhiyyah, and so on and so forth. And then we spent a little bit of time specifically on the notion of the justice of God or divine justice, and the problem of evil in the world, the problems of determinism and predestination, al-qada wal-qadar, and related issues to that. And with that, we would have concluded the first part of the course on Islamic beliefs, usually related to divinities and topics related to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and usually those are referred to as ilahiyat. And then in the second volume, we try to answer the second question, which is, what are we doing here? Well, how am I supposed to live? What am I doing in this life? And we explained, again, based on everything that we had presented in the first part, that, based on the access to knowledge that we have and don't have, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also guiding human beings through, in addition to their reason and their empirical access to the material world, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides them through another means of knowledge, another source of knowledge, which is revelation. And that entire topic becomes the theme of prophethood or nubuwwah, and everything related to religion in general, revelation and religion in general. So from there we started talking about general prophethood. General prophethood meaning those topics and those questions that are usually discussed or researched or explored when it comes to prophethood in general, to all prophets. So what is a prophet, and what is the need for a prophet, and what is revelation? What's the nature of revelation? How do we ensure that it's actually the same revelation communicated from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one that we get? And then we discussed some of the characteristics of the prophets, spending a little bit more time on their infallibility and the reason why they have to be human beings, to be role models so that we can follow them in this world. And then we went into how do you prove that someone is actually a prophet as they're claiming, which opens the door to miracles and the different types of things that may break away with the natural order of things, explaining that they're not all miracles. And we went into some more details, the different ranks of the prophets, between a prophet, a nabi, and a rasul, ulil azm, and all that topic in general. And with that in mind, so everything that we said in general, now we went to try to apply it to a specific prophet. And in this case, because we don't have time to discuss all the prophets that we would like to, we specifically concentrated on the prophethood of our prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so we spent a few lectures on basically applying those general principles that we covered in general prophethood to his prophethood. So how do we establish that he is a prophet? And we talked about the 3 ways or 4 ways to establish prophethood. And then we concentrated a little bit more on his main miracle being the Holy Quran. And we talked about the authenticity of the Quran, the miraculous nature. What do we mean when we say that the Holy Quran is miraculous? And then we went into the general description of the message of the Holy Prophet, or the teachings of the Holy Prophet, which are supposed to be, as the claim goes, they're supposed to be universal and eternal. And so we discussed that, trying to understand what does that mean exactly. And all of this related to, obviously, the topic of what we call al-Khatamiyya, so the sealing of the prophethood, meaning that the Holy Prophet is the last of the prophets, or the last of the communications to mankind, to humankind. And with that, we covered the topic of general prophethood and the specific prophethood of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with some related discussions on the Holy Quran, as we said. And to complete that entire discussion, then we said that in our case, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided that he would continue this guidance to humanity to ensure that the message of the Holy Prophet is understood as it should be. This is the last message to humankind, with all the enemies that the Holy Prophet had and all the attacks against his religion during his time and even afterwards. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knew that there would be distortions, there might be ways for people to try to change, alter, lose the teachings of the Holy Prophet, the authentic teachings of the Holy Prophet, as happened with previous prophets and messengers. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the case of Islam, also completed the teachings of the Holy Prophet to mankind through the chain of guidance of the Imamah. So we spent a little bit of time trying to understand what is the need for Imamah. Why would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have chosen to add or complement the prophethood of the Holy Prophet with the Imamah? And what does it mean? What are the characteristics of the Imam? So we spent a little bit of time saying, first of all, that these are divinely appointed people, that they have to be infallible, that they have to have access to divine knowledge, and that knowledge has to also be an infallible type of knowledge. And finally, with all of this, we spent a little bit of time talking about the imamah of specifically two imams. The first imam, to explain how the cycle of the imamah began with Imam Ali alayhi salam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, peace and blessings upon him. And then the imamah of the last of the imams, Imam al-Mahdi, ajallahu ta'ala faraj al-sharif, and who is the imam of our time, and obviously the biggest issue or concern or problem that people may have around his imamah is the fact that he is in an occultation. He is in a ghaibah right now, so we do not see him, we do not encounter him in our daily lives. So what is the reason for this, and how do we deal with this, and what are the arguments to show that it is true or not, and what happens at the end of times, and that entire topic. So when we put all of this together, what we have reached until now is the foundation of our belief system that has to do with where do we come from and what are we doing here. So the where do we come from question is everything related to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his attributes, and our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then what are we doing here is the answer that we get once we study and discuss and understand the topic of religion, prophethood, and imamah all taken together. So the next question is going to be, where are we going? What next? What now? So before we jump into the lesson, so this was the recap, and hopefully you see that as kind of a premise to the introduction of the lesson. Before I jump into it, maybe just one quick methodological remark, and then we can get into it. And it's that obviously when we began this course and when we began these lectures, we are trying to build that foundation of beliefs. So we are starting from nothing, from scratch. As we went along, we established the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We established the type of God that he is based on his attributes. We established the validity of religion and revelation and scripture, and specifically the scripture of the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with the Holy Quran, and that he is a guide to human beings, therefore the authenticity or validity of his sunnah, of his tradition. And then we complemented that with the infallibility and the divine knowledge of the imams, and that they are divinely appointed to be followed. Therefore, we establish their authority as well. So by now, it should be okay for us, if someone has followed along, that we are not only always going to rely solely on the rational arguments to establish anything. Because now, in addition to our rational faculty, and the philosophical, logical, reasonable, rational arguments that we can create and reach conclusions from, we also have access to the scripture. We have access to the Holy Quran. We have access to the narrations, because we've established the validity, the authenticity, the authority of those sources of knowledge as being secure, as being valid, as being sources of knowledge that we can anchor our beliefs in with certitude, with certainty. So do not be surprised as we go along in this specific part of the course that we are now going to rely more than we have until now on the Holy Quran and on the narrations where it makes sense to do so. So these are kind of like the methodological remarks before we get in. And now that with all of this in mind, let's look at the actual lesson, and then I will come back to the series overall at the end of the lesson, inshallah, so that it's clear where we're going with this entire series, and maybe a couple of remarks about that as well. So this lesson basically says, based on everything that we have, so this is the introduction, a quick reminder of what we've done until now, which was the recap that I just gave. Based on all of this, we want to start embarking on the last question, which the author does not refer to anymore here in the third part, and try to understand, before we get into the topic itself, before we try to establish, the proof for, how do we know for sure that there is an afterlife or not, before he talks about anything related to that, he's trying to establish the importance of studying this topic. Why are we going to expend our energy and our time and get into this topic? And, as we said, he's dedicated the entire part, the last part, into, if we look at the belief system as being three parts, the entire third part is dedicated to the topic of the afterlife or the hereafter. So why are we considering this topic to be of such an importance? So, in general, we're going to spend a little bit of time trying to establish this, and then we're going to look specifically at the importance that the Holy Quran gives to this topic and start to look at what does the Quran say about it. What does it say about the importance of understanding and believing in the afterlife or the hereafter? And then what is the conclusion of all of this, which is going to be our starting point for the next lectures or next lessons. So in the introduction, the author tells us that in the previous lessons, all the lessons leading up to where we are today, what we've established is that human beings have certain needs and are created in a certain way, and that part of that, an intrinsic part of their nature, is to have voluntary actions based on their free will that stem from a belief system, that stem from a worldview. And based on how a human being is going to behave, to conduct themselves, you can tell what kind of worldview they believe in. And their understanding and the importance they give to that conduct, to those behaviors, and that worldview is the manner in which we can assess their level of humanity. And we've talked about all of this. So this is kind of a recap, a quick recap. So for me to know, am I really exercising my humanity in my existence today or not? What I'm looking for first and foremost is to see how am I behaving, and to understand that that behavior stems from a belief. No matter what conduct, what belief, what behavior happens in this world, it stems from a belief. So I need to know what kind of importance I have given to belief, this system of belief. Have I actually considered it, looked at it seriously enough? Or am I just going along with the flow and not really studying this entire aspect in my life and concentrating on other things? Okay, so first and foremost, what we've established is that the humanity of a human being, their level of humanity, is going to depend on their understanding of their beliefs and the voluntary actions that stem from those beliefs. And so specifically, the two headings that we've explored now is monotheism or tawheed and all the related topics, and the guidance that we get based on that monotheism, which is revelation, which is an-nubuwwah and al-imamah, which we have covered until now. So now that we are at this point of trying to understand where do we go from here, now that I understand that I have certain duties, I have teachings that I have to adhere to, that where I come from and what am I doing here, what is so distinctive, what is so important, what is so special and different about this new aspect, new dimension of the triad that's forming my worldview, that is called, my worldview, or in our parlance, we're going to say my religion. And here, there is going to be a necessity in order to understand what's important about the hereafter or the afterlife. There is going to be a direct link between that belief, depending on what I believe in about the afterlife, depending on what I believe in about the hereafter, my individual conduct is going to be very different. That's one. And two, the collective conduct, if you look at a community or you look at a society or you look at a global level, you're going to see that that conduct is going to be very different based on the belief in or lack of belief in, or whatever the belief may be in the afterlife or the hereafter. So we're going to look at that. And then it's going to become clear that in order for that belief to make sense, in order for someone to be able to establish on a rational foundation the belief in the afterlife, they are now going to require an ingredient, which is the soul. That soul is immaterial and eternal. Okay? And then within those two big areas, two big topics, there's going to be all sorts of other related issues, all of them having to do with the afterlife or the hereafter that we are going to need to explore. So, what is the importance of believing in the hereafter? As we said, we're going to just recuperate that argument that we explained, I think, in enough detail previously. A human being, whatever they do, whatever conduct, whatever behavior, whatever act they are about to do, the true motivation behind it stems from their belief system. If I'm going to brush my teeth, it's because this is part of a belief system that this is going to allow me to become more perfect. Or based on another version, to become more happy. Whatever the ultimate bottom line happens to be for your worldview. This is going to get you the closest to your perfection. And so when you're deciding, do I brush my teeth or not, it depends on the value you're giving to one or the other of the items that give you happiness or give you perfection. So if you choose one, you are actually going to get up and brush your teeth. If you choose the other, let's say your comfort, your immediate comfort versus long-term comfort versus long-term, let's say aesthetics or whatever it may be, you may decide not to get up to brush your teeth or get up to brush your teeth. Very simple example, but this applies to everything, from the simplest, most banal things that we encounter in our lives to the most complicated, deep, existential questions that we have and from which we decide what to do next. Everything that we do is going to stem from what is my perceived perfection, and once that is established, whether it's conscious or not, then my conduct is going to follow. If that is the case, then it becomes very clear that for a human being to be a human being, because you're not only driven by raw instinct, because you have to have this existential frame or background for you to act, you need a target. You need an objective that you're moving towards. And that, the more coherent and cohesive and integrated that is in your worldview, the more it's going to align everything you do towards that target. If you do not have that specific target or that specific purpose, that objective, existential objective as a human being, then your actions are going to be scattered. They're not going to look like they are coherent with themselves. You're basically not living a human life. You might be acting more like an animal. You are only obeying the animal aspect of your existence and not taking full advantage and leveraging the human dimension of your reality, which is what you really are. So for me to assess any action, whether I am going to undertake it and how much energy I'm going to put in it or not, I have to see how does it fit into that bigger framework. How does it allow me or not to reach that bigger purpose or that objective that aligns, that is supposed to align and allow me to assess everything I do. And this is something we can do for others. I can do that to assess to what extent someone's actions, the quality and quantity of their actions follow in that or not direction, and I can do it for myself. Now, the type of life that I'm going to live, if you keep that in mind, the type of life I'm going to live is going to be completely different. If in my worldview, if I happen to live, as we said, a materialist worldview, in a materialist worldview, I am limited to this body. And everything I do is limited to what this body can experience and can acquire and can gain in this world. If this is my worldview, then all of my conduct is going to be entirely determined by this worldview and by this set of beliefs. And of course, if you are going to have a worldview where you have God in the middle, say, or a theistic worldview, a worldview where you may believe in an afterlife, you may believe that not everything ends once this body dies, then you are not going to conduct yourself in the same manner. And if you do, you're not being coherent with that belief, which, you know, as a reminder, we'll say may not actually be a belief. There's a difference between someone who agrees with you at a logical level, and let's say they say, of course there's an afterlife, of course there's a heaven and hell. We believe, but there's no faith. You believe at a rational level, but the way you conduct yourself means that you're not actually integrating that as a belief, as a matter, as an article of faith. Okay, so let's make that distinction. So depending on where you see your happiness and where you see your perfection, you're going to have a completely different worldview. You're going to have a completely different set of behaviors and actions. Now, if I have the materialist worldview, then my life is going to be planned in a certain way and is going to be moving in a certain direction. And if I have a theistic worldview, then my life is going to be planned in a different way, or at least it ought to be, and I should be moving in a different direction. And this applies, as we said, based on the examples that we gave, from the simplest thing that you may decide, do I act, don't I act, do I behave, how do I conduct myself, to the deepest and most complex decisions that you have to make in your life. And at the very, very concrete level, if someone really understands this, then you're also going to understand it's going to affect your mental health. It's going to affect your resilience in life. It's going to affect every action that you take, consciously or unconsciously. It's going to be directly linked to your moral system. Someone, you know, as a very quick example, and I'm sure some of you may or may not have experienced this. So I'm gonna present it as a theoretical example, but this is not a theoretical example. Say there are people in an airplane, and that plane is about to land, but it's not landing. And then the rumor comes, and then the confirmation comes from the pilot that there's a glitch, and he cannot open the wheels for the plane to actually land. And after a certain while, as people start panicking and they're wondering what's happening and the plane can't keep circling, they decide that that's it, we are going to land. So people, brace yourselves for a very rough landing. There might be casualties, there might be very big problems and risks, but that's what we have to do. We have to land the plane directly, the bottom of the plane directly on the tarmac, on the surface. At that moment, the person who has belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in God, in an afterlife, if they happen to be a Muslim, for instance, they're going to say their shahada, they're going to be preparing themselves in case this is the end. And this is the unsurprising outcome of every human life. And I know where I'm going and I know what's waiting for me. And I deal with it in this manner. I say my tashahhud, I remember some verses of the Quran, and what happens will happen. And when this actually happens, and if you see those types of situations, you will see those who have a materialist worldview, many of them losing consciousness, screaming and yelling and panicking, perfectly normal, expected human behavior. But the person who has something to look forward to and who is relying on their conduct on a different worldview should not be behaving in this manner. And oftentimes what happens afterwards, so, you know, as I said, these are real situations. The person with the belief system, with this type of belief system that there is a God and that everything in his hands is in his hands, and that at the end of this, if the outcome is that we die, then we die, and that's okay. And if it's not, and I leave here alive, and that's okay too. But I'm prepared for all of these eventualities, and they have a place in my worldview. And you see that when this happens, that person walks away and the others have to be taken to, you know, assuming that nothing happens. And in this specific case that I'm describing, at the last second, the wheels actually unjammed and opened and the plane was able to land safely with no casualties and no injuries, and people were taken right away from the ambulance. But many of them, they were more psychologically traumatized than anything. And the people with the stronger worldview are able to walk away a little shaken, of course, because it's normal, but based on your belief in that worldview and what you believe in, you're not going to be reacting in the same way. This is what we mean when we say this is going to show in your mental health, your resilience in life, depending on what you believe in. If you believe that there's a God who has your back and has your support, and who has created a certain system, and you know how you fit into that system, and you know that there's an afterlife, and you know that that afterlife means all justice is going to be reestablished because we live in an unjust world, you're not going to be dealing and reacting and interacting or exchanging with this world and your experiences in it in the same way. You have a certain background that allows you to find peace even in the most difficult of circumstances when you have this type of worldview. And then when we apply all of this, so if you keep in mind that there is an afterlife and there is a hereafter, something happens after you die, then here is where we look at the individual and we look at the collective. At an individual level, you're going to see, this was an example of someone at the individual level. You're not going to live your life in the same way. If you know that there's something waiting for you after you die, you cannot live your life in the same manner as someone who is a materialist, who thinks that everything ends the moment they close their eyes for the last time. And then when you look at the collective, when you look at groups of people living together, you see that that person who believes is not going to be interacting with other human beings in the same manner. I don't need an external law, and these are the connections to be made with the legal systems, with enforcement systems, to establish a morality, right? You need to establish that from the outside when people are carrying it internally. If I believe that if I do something, that something is going to harm me in the afterlife, there is already something that is pushing me back from a barrier that acts much better than any legal system can, any enforcement system can, to prevent me from doing certain things. Those things may not even cross my mind, that I would steal or that I would cheat or that I would transgress the rights of someone else. And to take it a step beyond and a step further, there might be a lot more compassion between people. Because I know that every time I do something good to someone else, I'm the one who's benefiting from it in my afterlife. So every time I see someone who needs my help, I will go out of my way to help them. I will sacrifice from myself to help them. Because at the end of the day, I'm the only one benefiting from this if I look at the big picture, which includes my eternal life and my eternal salvation and happiness and so on and so forth. Okay. And of course, we can take this at global level and think about if everyone actually believed that there are true, and I mean true belief, that there are actual, just, equitable rewards and punishments to every act that takes place in this world. If you do something, something is waiting for you on the other side. If it's good, then it will be good. If it's bad, then it will be bad. If you actually believed in this, you think that the world would be in the state that it is in today. That humanity would be living the manner in which it is living today, or that it has lived for most of its history. So if we continue with this line of thought, we understand, and that's what the author is trying to do here, to make us realize and understand the importance of this topic of belief in the afterlife or the hereafter. So if someone has a very strong belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his attributes, is that enough? Well, the author is categorical in saying that this is not enough. Your belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not going to be enough to direct all of your actions in this world, because it's a very theoretical, abstract belief. What I may add here is that if you are one of those truly exceptional people, if you are one of these people who can resemble Imam Ali alayhi salam, for instance, in their understanding of who and what God truly is, and that you will worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not for any benefit, but because he is truly worthy of worship, and that you are in that type of love relationship with your God, with your creator, with existence, with the absolute. If you're in that type of relationship, yes, that is going to be directing your behavior in this world. But that's not the case of the crushing majority of human beings. So you need something more. You need something that is going to be more than abstract and theoretical for you to be directed in all of your behavior and all of your actions and your worldview towards in a certain path, in a certain direction, in a certain orientation. And this is why when we look at the manner in which the prophets preached and taught their people, they really emphasized on this belief, the belief in the afterlife, the belief in the hereafter, that something will happen after you guys die, telling the masses of their followers and their people. And the author tells us, in fact, they did this more, their emphasis and insistence and their focus on the afterlife was even more than their focus on belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's going to come back to that and explain it in a second why. So, belief in a life after death, belief that something is going to happen after we die, the author tells us just a belief like this in the afterlife or the hereafter is not enough. Because I may be of those who believe that something happens, but I also believe in, let's say, a version where I go into that other world and then I get to live in the same manner I'm living here. In other words, I go and get to decide and voluntarily act, and based on my actions, something will happen or not, a little bit like what we have in this world. So you have room to maneuver, you have room to do things and not do things, and based on that, something else. You have a cause, you have an effect, and that's how that world is going to work. If this is, for instance, your understanding of what happens after you die and the kind of world waiting for you, you're not going to live in the same manner as, say, someone who believes that when you go there, the type of world awaiting for you is a world where you cannot act anymore. That whatever you did in this world, in this life, between the time you were born and the time you died, is all that will matter in that world, because it's going to be a replica of what happened here, but you're going to get the other side of it, which is the true essence of those actions that you performed in this world. That's a completely different understanding of that afterlife. So the author tells us it's not enough to only believe that there is an afterlife. You have to go a step further and try to understand the relationship for yourself. You have to determine for yourself, what's the relationship between this world and the next world? Is it that everything that happens here 100% is replicated there? Does it happen in a different way? If I can act here, can I still act there? And so on and so forth. And this is the link between voluntary actions here and reward and punishment there. And of course, we're going to explore that in a lot more detail in later lectures. Okay? So if you do not take that belief in the afterlife all the way to this point, then that may not necessarily become your directing principle in the manner in which you're going to conduct yourself in this world. So now let's turn to the Holy Quran. Now that we understand a little bit why this is a very important axis in your belief system, let's turn to the Holy Quran to see what it says. The theme, the big theme of an afterlife, or something that happens the moment you die, and that not everything ends. In fact, everything begins after you die. True life begins after you die. That's how the Holy Quran presents it, is an extremely important theme in the Holy Quran. The minimum, when I have looked at what the scholars say, the minimum number of verses that scholars say refer to the afterlife in the Holy Quran is 1,400 plus verses. And so depending on how you're counting the verses, because sometimes the reference to the afterlife is, in a batch of verses, and all of them are taken, or only the ones directly referring to it are taken, it's anywhere between 1,400 and 2,200 plus verses of the Holy Quran dealing with the afterlife. And that's why he summarizes all of this, and he says a third of the verses of the Holy Quran deal with the afterlife. So obviously we're not going to go through the entire Quranic theory or what the Quran says about the afterlife. That would be a gigantic task. But let's look at a few batches of verses specifically related to this topic of the importance of the afterlife and the belief in the afterlife. So we have verses in the Holy Quran. So every time you see an underlined in the slides, it's because that's one category of verses very quickly. The importance of the belief in the afterlife itself. Many verses of the Quran. One of them is in Surah Al-Baqarah, the 4th verse. The pious are the ones who, al-muttaqun, are who those who believe in what has been sent down to you and what has been sent down before you. So someone might think, okay, so you believe in Allah, you believe in the revelation, that's enough. No, no. And the other condition is, and are certain of the hereafter or the afterlife. They have certainty that there's going to be an afterlife. Those are the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala refers to as the believers. If someone does not believe in an afterlife, someone might think, well, the rest of their belief system is okay. They just have issues, doubts, problems with this part of the belief system. What happens to them? Well, the Holy Quran again and again says their entire belief system is not valid if this part is missing. That's why it says, for instance, 23:74, and indeed those who do not believe in the hereafter surely deviate from the path. عَنِ الصِّرَاطِ لَنَاكِبُونَ, it says in the Quran. Those are not going to be able to remain on the sirat. So you can take that metaphorically, on the right path, or you can take that as the sirat on which we are told we're all going to walk in the afterlife. Rather, they deny the hour, as-sa'a, which is one of the names of Yawm al-Qiyamah. They deny the hour, and we have prepared a blaze for those who deny the hour. So, and it continues, there are verses that speak about the eternal bounties awaiting those who believe. Allah has promised the faithful, men and women, gardens with streams running in them, to remain in them forever, and good dwellings in the gardens of Eden. Yet Allah's pleasure is greater than all of these. That is the great success. And here you have batches of verses. I don't have time to go through them, so I have them here for your reference if you want to go back and read some of these verses that speak about the eternal bounties that are awaiting those who believe. And then on the other side, indeed those who are faithless and do wrong, Allah shall never forgive them, nor shall He guide them to any way except the way to hell, to remain in it forever. And that is easy for Allah. And then again, a few series of verses that you can go back and refer to about the same topic. Here again, a few more categories that I don't have verses about just to save time. The relationship between good and bad, and we are going to talk about that later. Okay, that's one. The relationship between the good deed and the bad deed, and we're going to come back to that as we said. And then the consequence of the good deed and the consequence of the bad deed. There are many verses that talk about all of this. Answering the objections of the deniers of the afterlife. Many verses about that. There are verses in the Quran that tell us that one of the main reasons why there is so much misguidance and deviation and corruption in this world is because people do not believe in the afterlife. So in one verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is talking to Prophet Dawood alayhi salam. He says, "O David, indeed we have made you a vicegerent, a khalifa on the earth. So judge between people with justice and do not follow desire, or it will lead you astray from the way of Allah." Now keep that in mind and see the next verse. "Indeed, those who stray from the way of Allah, there is severe punishment for them because of their forgetting the day of reckoning." So the afterlife. Or in another verse, "So taste the punishment for your having forgotten the encounter of this day of yours. We too have forgotten you." So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He forgets someone, it means that they just continue into their misguidance and their corrupt and perverted ways. Taste the everlasting punishment because of what you used to do. Okay. Now, allow me just to click to see, can we get this? Yes, of course, the slides will be shared afterwards. So the importance given to the afterlife in the Holy Quran, we continue with that. So why does the Holy Quran insist on the afterlife in this manner? And why does the Holy Quran tell us that the prophets insisted to this point, and the Holy Prophet, our Holy Prophet, insisted to this point on this specific belief? Why? Few answers can be given. They've been summarized here in two. And then there's another one that is sometimes presented in some works, so I'm adding it here just so that you have the full picture. The first reason is the Holy Quran, every time it talks about something immaterial from alam al-ghayb, from the unseen world, it's going to emphasize on it a little bit more. And the reason for this, very simply, is because the Holy Quran and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the human being, knows that human beings have a tendency to deny anything that is not immediately present to them, that is not in the material world that they experience and live in daily. So if I don't see it, I don't feel it, I don't touch it, I don't taste it, then it must not exist. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala insists on those types of beliefs that are a little bit more difficult for someone who wants to start from a position of materialism. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala insists on it a lot more to get the people to see it from all sorts of different angles. That's one. So it's kind of a recognition of the true human nature that tends to lean towards materialism. That's one. And two, one of the reasons why is that people want to deny because it's going to free them up from the responsibility that comes once you open the door to believing that there is an afterlife and there's a hereafter and there's a reward and there's a punishment and you have to be accountable. That's it. Your life is going to change. The moment you say there is something after death, you can't live in the same way anymore. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala insists on this, and why there are people who continue to insist and deny. And the Holy Quran refers to this, perhaps in Surah Al-Qiyamah, those verses that you have here, Surah Al-Qiyamah. Does the human being think that we shall not assemble his bones? Most assuredly, we are able to perfectly restore the very tips of his fingers, but the human wishes to go on doing wrong. And that's the reason. It's because so long as there is nothing awaiting, so long as there is no reason for you not to, do the right, even if it means it goes against your desires and it goes against your pleasures and it goes against whatever you feel like doing. If there's a reason, then that's it, you're restricted. And if there's no reason, so what do? You close that door entirely and say, there is no afterlife. And then that's it, you're freed. You are completely unrestricted now to behave as you wish, do as you wish, and this is actually the reason why the world is in the state it's in. And this is the link that I would like to make here. I don't have time to give a full lecture on this, but this is the entire question that new atheism has been trying again and again to answer. It's if you believe in a materialist worldview, then where does your morality come from? Where does your moral code come from if everything ends the moment you die? Do you have any it's not that if you want to pretend, you want to create something and impose something on you, that's besides the point. Where does the driver come from, a normal human being, to behave in a certain way, let's say at their own expense, or not take something that they feel like taking, or transgress on the right of someone else? Say they're in a position of power where they have nothing to lose. Then what is stopping them if there is no moral code? Is it the law? What if they can go around the law? What if they're a tyrant? What if they can change the law? What happens to morality? And what we're talking about is internal. Where does that come from? And where does it go once you completely disqualify that entire dimension of your existence, which is anything that happens after you die? Okay? Just something to keep in mind. The third reason that is sometimes given for people not to believe is that they want to maintain their power. And so this is a little bit more specific. The Holy Quran spends a lot of time on this, explaining the special importance and the special accountability and responsibility that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put on the shoulders of the elites, those who are in positions of power, political power, financial power, social power, cultural power, intellectual power. If you're in a position of power, you are part of the elites. You have a lot more to gain and a lot more to lose if the direction, the social direction, the cultural direction, the religious direction goes in a certain way or in another. And so there's a lot more responsibility on you. And this is in the Holy Quran, it's constantly, when the prophets go to see their people and they're talking to their heads, the Pharaohs and the Caesars and those who are in command, when the prophets get to them, it's always those around them because they are the elites. They're the mala', the elites, and those who are in power, who have the most to gain and lose, and the ones who are usually the most against any change to the system because they are going to lose a lot on what they currently have. So that's one of the other reasons. But of course, it could be subsumed under one of the two reasons that we gave until now, which is, your desire to be, it's an immaterial thing, one, or two, that you are going to be restricted in your freedoms. So the maintaining of power for the elites falls a little bit under that, unless you want to highlight kind of the collective or social dimension to it. So if we go back to the Holy Quran also tells us that there is a little bit of trickery that sometimes happens to some who think that they're trying to be a little bit more sophisticated. So the author reminds us these are the shayateen, these are people who are acting like the devil. And we're going to come to that in a second. So there's a trickery. They talk more about, they insist more about this desire to try to create this idea of the perfect society, the idea that I can establish justice on earth if we can move in certain directions. You know, let's say if you can take communism, the communist dream to the extreme, then what do you have? You have a completely just society, everybody is at peace, living together, and so on and so forth. So it's this paradise on earth idea. So the idea is, you know, forget this mythology, forget this kind of fiction that you have created for yourselves as believers in a world that we cannot see and we cannot feel and we cannot live in. So it's kind of postponing what you're supposed to do there. It's just creating false hopes for yourselves. And if only you concentrated only on this world, you would be able to create all those things that you aspire to and that are described in your scriptures. You could be able to create them here. Okay? And of course, you know, this is a fallacy and we don't have time to get into it right now, into the details of it. But the gist of it is that it does not mean because I believe in an afterlife that I'm going to become a passive human being, that I let anything happen and I just kind of completely give up and whatever happens, happens. And that's not at all what our religion teaches us. In fact, it teaches us the opposite. And that is part of our duty, to stand up for the right and to go against the wrong and so on and so forth. So that's one. And two, there are those who emphasize on interpreting all of this as being symbols, as being the mythology. You know, so if you understand these, they are not to be taken literally. They are to be taken figuratively. None of this is going to happen the way that it's going to happen. So again, concentrate on this world. And here the Holy Quran may be referring to those people in certain ways. When it says, for instance, in some verses, those who are Dahriyeen, as they are referred to, certainly we and our fathers were promised this before, but these are just myths of the ancients. Or when they say, as for him who says to his parents, the Holy Quran says, fie on you. You promise me that I shall be raised from the dead when generations have passed away before me. And they invoke Allah's help, his parents, saying, woe to you, believe, indeed Allah's promise is true. But he says these are nothing but myths of the ancients. And I think this is in one way or another something that we hear nowadays. And so we can go back to another verse of the Holy Quran and watch how this verse portrays some of what is said out there in society, some of what is out there in the mass communications, mass media. And thus did we make for every prophet an enemy, evil ones from among humans and jinn, who inspire each other with a flowery discourse through deception. And had thy Lord so planned, they would not have done so. So leave them and their forgeries alone. To such deceit let the hearts of those who do not believe in the afterlife incline, and let them earn from it what they may. So, in conclusion from all of this that we have said, what we need, and this is going to be, as we said, the starting point for the entire series. What we need at this point is, if you want to be a serious human being, if you want to be someone who is going to live fully your humanity, then you have to make a commitment to understand this topic and to find an answer for yourself to these questions. You have to reach a conclusion for yourself. Is death the end or not? Is there an afterlife or not? If there is, then what's the relationship between this world and the next world? Is it just another dimension, or is it a very specific kind of dimension that means that you have to do certain things here because over there you won't be able to, for instance? And at the bottom of this is, therefore, how am I supposed to live? The answers to these questions are going to dictate the manner in which you're going to live. Now, the author here concludes all of this with a reminder of something that I think we discussed in enough detail when we initially began this entire course. So I say it simply as a reminder now, that do not forget the wager. So whether you want to consider it Pascal's wager or the other versions that we gave of it, if you have any situation with a certain level of probability, a lot of people are going to make the mistake and concentrate only on the probability. So let's say, for argument's sake, that the probability that there is an afterlife is extremely low. So let's work with a 1%. There's a 1% chance. There's 1 in 1,000. There's 1 in 1,000,000 chance that what we're saying is true. How do human beings deal with probability? Do they only look at the probability, or do they go beyond it and look at what is at stake? So if someone tells you you only have 1 in 1,000,000 chance or 1 in 10 million chances of winning the lottery, but the lottery is $1 billion, well, a lot of people are going to give a lot of money and try to win that lottery, even if the probability is very, very low. Why? Because they think that what's at stake is worth it. And on the opposite side, you're very, very thirsty and there's a cup in front of you. And someone tells you there's 1 in 100, 1% chance that there might be poison in this and you may die. I would bet that the majority, the crushing majority of human beings would not drink that water, regardless of how thirsty they are, because they are going to think that what's at stake is not worth it. It's not worth it for me to risk my life, even if it's just 1% chance. That percent, it's not about the 1%, it's about what am I losing? You cannot only look at the probability, you have to look at what's at stake and the probability. Because as the value of what's at stake increases, then the outcome becomes worth it or not. And not only with the probability. And I'm not going to get into the math equation of this, but you have to multiply them. And if this is logical, which it is, then what bigger wager is there than your eternal life? So if we're saying that at the end of this, there's only 1% chance that everything we're saying is true. There's only a 1% chance that there's an afterlife, a hereafter, something happens after death, and that it depends entirely on how you behave and how you conduct yourself in this world. Only 1% chance. But it would mean that you are either eternally happy or eternally miserable. Then what's at stake here? It's your eternal life. It's your eternal existence. And it cannot be taken lightly. It cannot be dismissed. And it needs to be considered very, very seriously for you to be decreed, to be deemed as a human being who's exercising their humanity. So allow me to end very quickly with I think I have one more, with this slide, a couple of remarks. The first one is simply to kind of give you a lay of the land on the topics that we're going to be addressing. So as we said, this is going to be a series as they are in the curriculum of 20 lessons. I'm still not sure whether we're going to dedicate one lecture to each lesson. I think some of the lessons are a little bit shorter, but some of them are a little bit longer. So here are some of the topics that are going to be on the agenda that inshallah we are going to be getting into in the next, in the following weeks. So the topic of the soul. And as we already hinted to it today, and inshallah you get a little bit of taste and excitement about these, the immateriality of the soul. If you cannot establish that there is an immaterial part of your existence and that it's going to be eternal, then you're going to have a lot of trouble establishing an afterlife. That's one. Two, the arguments and of course the objections to those arguments for an afterlife. And so we're going to look at, are there actually any rational arguments, just like we did with the existence of Allah, just like subhanahu wa ta'ala, just like we did with prophethood, miracles, infallibility, so on and so forth. Are there actually any rational arguments to establish the validity of the belief in an afterlife? Death and onwards. So looking at the journey a little bit, we're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but a little bit of that journey. What happens when we die? What is death? and what happens afterwards all the way to Yawm al-Qiyamah and then beyond. And then what are the characteristics of that Yawm al-Qiyamah? What's the image that the Holy Quran gives us about the end of times on our side, and then what happens once we basically wake up and get into the afterlife, actually in the afterlife. What is the nature of the relationship? And I think we emphasized this one a few times today. The nature of the relationship between what happens in this world, in this life, and what happens in the afterlife. What is the nature of that relationship? This triad of faith, I believe in something and I have intentions related to my faith, and then what I do about it, the actions, and then the reward. There is a dynamic relationship there that we will look at. And then what happens if I do something good? May I lose it, or is it there permanently in my record for me to get the reward? And the opposite. If I do something bad, is there a way to get rid of that, or is it permanently in my record? And then finally, what is this topic of the intercession? So when I look at intercession, this topic of shafa'ah, is there such a thing? How does it work? Is it compatible with justice or not? And my final point about all of this is that, regardless of all of this, maybe before I mention the point, allow me simply to say that, so I don't know what's happening on the screen here. Someone is, I don't know what they're doing.
Maybe we can stop the sharing, Said, because you're almost done.
Okay. I think it's okay now. So very quickly, allow me simply to say that obviously those topics that we just mentioned are not going to cover everything related to the big theme and big topic of the afterlife and the hereafter. So depending on how these are going to go, I may supplement them with a few other topics that are kind of usually considered subtopics, but there might be, depending on the interest, the questions that we get, we may decide to dedicate either some sessions for Q&A or complement within the actual topics that we're going to be covering, those other subtopics. So that's one quick remark. And the second quick remark, which has nothing to do with all of this. One question that we see a lot, that we get a lot. People are always wondering, and I think it applies to all of us, what do I need to do to become more spiritual? What do I need to do to feel spirituality, to feel that I want to move towards purity, to cleanse my heart and my soul? What do I need to do? What can I do? What are some tricks? What are some tips? And there are a lot of answers that can be given here. There are entire books and entire series of lectures dedicated to this extremely important topic. But I think at the top of that list of those answers that can be given should always, always be the topic of death and the afterlife. This is what the Holy Prophet teaches us. So while our lectures, because this is an introductory course to the belief system, what we're trying to establish, what we're trying to provide is a foundation of beliefs so that you as a believer understand what you believe in, one, and two, that whatever you believe in, you understand why you believe in it. And so that at least once you go into out there in the real world, you're never confronted with situations where that belief of yours, whether it's a specific belief or your entire belief system, is suddenly shaken up because you've encountered a question, because you've encountered an objection, and the entire edifice of belief crumbles because it's not resting on a solid ground of a rational system and argumentation. And usually once that's in place, then you can add your layer of spirituality to it, your akhlaq to it, your cleansing of your soul to it. Because there are obviously premises. If you lose your faith, then there is no more room to talk about how you're going to spiritually purify yourself. We need to make sure first that your faith is solid, especially in the kind of world that we live in, where faith is attacked left and right on every angle, especially Islamic faith, but faith in general. Okay, so this course is not dedicated to spirituality. This course is dedicated to, let's call it, the more theoretical and abstract and dry field of theology, of beliefs, right? And so this is what we're going to do. As you see, we're providing arguments and proofs and going to whether they are rational or scriptural, and trying to establish belief in different topics and subjects and articles of faith. But all that said, my recommendation, my advice, my suggestion to all of you and to myself is that also use this as a constant reminder that we are all going to die. And that is your starting point. It will always be the best starting point to be spiritual, to cleanse yourself, to purify your heart. The reminder that there is death. The reminder that this relationship that I have with the world, with my body, with my family, with my wealth, with everything that I see and encounter and experience in this world is temporal, is temporary, it's leaving, and that there is something more permanent in me, and that's the part that I should be, therefore, concentrating on and giving it its proper worth. It's not that I neglect the rest, and that's why our religion has put duties and rights in place so that none of it is neglected. But at the same time, I have to understand where my priorities are. You know, there's a story that comes to my mind. Allow me to finish with this. I didn't want to take this long. Allow me to finish with this story to highlight how your life changes based on your worldview. We're told that when Imam Ali alayhi salam had become a Khalifa, so please keep this part in mind and put yourself in his shoes as the leader of the Islamic world. Okay, at the time of Imam Ali alayhi salam, if not the biggest, one of the biggest empires of the world. One of his companions says, I came to see the Imam after he had been a Khalifa, and I saw him sitting in, the riwayah says, a dar. So it could be a room, it could be a house, a building. I came into a house where the Imam was sitting alone, and the place was absolutely unfurnished except for a hasira. So hasira is an Arabic word that basically means that it's basically a mat made of straw. You know, you see it, some people roll it up and they pray on it, very simple. And he says he was sitting on a small hasira. And so this companion of the Imam, when he comes in, he tells the Imam, you know, you have access under your hand, you have access to the treasuries of the state. And it's almost like the man is kind of telling the Imam that this is kind of inappropriate for the Khalifa of the Islamic world to be sitting in this manner, in this place, in this way, on a hasira. And the Imam looked to him, he says, he looked at me and he said, because the man was basically telling him, why don't you furnish this place up a little? And the Imam tells him, it is not a trait of someone who has intellect. Al-Labib. Al-Labib is someone who has intellect or someone who has wisdom, to furnish a temporary house. So imagine yourself traveling in the desert and you're stopping for the night, you put up a tent and you stay in it for the night, and then you move away to go to your destination. Imam Ali alayhi salam tells him, it is not one of the traits of those who have intelligence to furnish a temporary house. So as for us, we have safe and permanent houses to which we have moved all of our possessions and all of our belongings. And we shall soon be moving into them. That's all the Imam answered. And so for us, this has to be, if this is truly your role model in life, if Imam Ali alayhi salam is your role model in life, I'm not saying that we can replicate this, but this needs to be our guiding principle, our North Star, as they say. That this is the direction in which you move, that you are constantly in making sure that you remind yourself that your relationship with this world is one that is temporary, and that your permanent house, your permanent abode is not here, and that your entire energy cannot be spent about things that are happening here in this world, with this body, with this money, with these people, on social media, on whatever it may be that consumes your time and your energy. And where are your priorities? That's the question. And so inshallah, as we go through these lectures, you keep this spiritual dimension in place, and that as we go through them, every time we talk about one of those topics, what you try to get out of it, in addition to the intellectual, theoretical points that we're covering, is what's the spiritual transformation that I can get for myself out of this. And I will, inshallah, trying to be doing the same as well. So I'm just going to look very quickly at, so there are no questions here. So thank you all very much. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin.